pitch-black waters of Ironbottom Sound on the late night of November 14, 1942, were a suffocating light arc. In this absolute blindness, aboard the United States Navy battleship USS Washington, radar operators were locked onto their glowing green screens. Exactly 18,000 yards away, 9 distinct blips were quietly sliding through the darkness, pulsing like the heartbeat of the Grim Reaper. Every sweep of the radar antenna updated the positions of a massive Japanese fleet. The enemy was entirely oblivious, still relying on searchlights. They were completely unaware that an American battleship was tracking their every move through the night. For 16 months, the crew had drilled relentlessly on this revolutionary SG surface search radar. It allowed them to see the invisible, spotting distant targets that were impossible to track. Traditional naval commanders, still bound by visual combat, deemed them impossible. Paired with this was the even more lethal Mark III fire control radar. This system was capable of locking onto targets in total darkness and calculating devastatingly precise firing solutions for the massive main guns. This perfect marriage of technologies gave the Washington a terrifying ability to fight blind and deliver one-hit kills in the dead of night. Almost no one in the high command of the Pacific Fleet actually believed a battleship could win a modern naval battle in the current era. This deeply rooted prejudice was about to cost countless American sailors their lives in blood. Ever since the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, a rigid consensus had taken hold within the highest echelons of the United States Navy. The era of the battleship was over for good. These floating steel fortresses were viewed as obsolete, expensive relics, relegated to serving merely as anti-aircraft escorts for carriers. Official tactical doctrine explicitly dictated that battleships should never actively seek out surface engagements, restricting them to defensive roles. Although the Washington had previously crossed the Atlantic to serve alongside the British home fleet, her massive guns had never fired on an enemy. Tonight, that humiliating streak was going to end. One battleship and one brilliant commander would use steel and fire to prove its power. But before that could happen, the 3,700 American sailors aboard the Washington first had to survive the most brutal surface brawl. The battleship herself was never the problem. The USS Washington was an absolute masterpiece of American engineering and industrial might. The second ship of the North Carolina class, her keel was laid at the Philadelphia and Naval Shipyard in June 1938. This steel behemoth boasted a standard displacement of 35,000 tons, swelling to 44,800 tons fully loaded. Her core striking power consisted of 9 16-inch Mark VI guns housed in 3 massive triple turrets. These weapons were truly apocalyptic. These apocalyptic weapons could hurl 2,700-pound, armor-piercing shells with world-ending kinetic energy at targets 20 miles away. Her 16-inch thick armor belt was an impenetrable shield, and the faceplates of her turrets were protected by 18 inches of solid steel. Deep within her hull, for General Electric steam turbines generated a staggering 121,000 shaft horsepower. She could hit hard, she could run fast, and she could absorb punishment. But she was deemed too expensive and precious to risk in a slugfest. Just 3 days prior to this fateful night, that conservative, rigid doctrine had been paid for in blood during the first naval battle. Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan had led Task Force 67 into these exact same waters to intercept a Japanese bombardment force. Callahan's fleet did not contain a single battleship. The Navy had 2 operational battleships in the rear to babysit the carrier enterprise. Because high-come and considered battleships too valuable to risk, Callahan sailed into the dark with only cruisers and destroyers. Result was an unmitigated disaster. In the first naval battle of Guadalcanal, Callahan's force blundered blindly into a Japanese fleet. What followed was not a tactical engagement, but a point-blank, chaotic barroom brawl in the dark where ships unleashed broadsides at point-blank. Ships unleashed broadsides at point-blank range, often unable to distinguish friend from foe. blinding searchlights turned the night into a nightmare. Blinding searchlights turned the night into a terrifying nightmare of glare and death. When the smoke cleared, Admiral Callahan lay dead. Admiral Callahan lay dead on the bridge of the San Francisco, killed by a direct hit from a 14-inch shell. Another Admiral, Norman Scott, was killed. Another Rear Admiral, Norman Scott, was killed aboard the Atlanta by friendly fire in the sheer confusion of the nightly naval battle. 4 American destroyers, the Barton, Cushing, Laffey, and Mons Sen, were sunk or sinking. The cruiser Atlanta was fatally damaged during the brawl. The cruiser Atlanta was fatally damaged, and the Juno was torpedoed and blown to atoms during the retreat, taking nearly her entire crew down. 706 American sailors perished in the catastrophic defeat. While the Japanese lost the High, the strategic situation was horrifying. While the Japanese lost the destroyer Akatsuki and the battleship High was crippled, the overall strategic situation for the Americans was horrifying. Back at Pearl Harbor, reading the after-action reports, Pacific Fleet Commander Admiral Chester Nimitz was filled with shock and dread tonight. The Marines holding Guadalcanal were on the verge of total collapse. Henderson Field, the vital airstrip that made the island worth bleeding for, was being mercilessly pounded by Japanese warships night after night. Even worse, intelligence indicated that an even larger Japanese fleet was steaming south toward the island. Commanded by Vice Admiral Nobu Taekwondo, this armada included the battleship Kirishima for heavy cruisers to light cruisers and 9 destroyers. Their mission was to turn Henderson Field into a cratered wasteland and cover the landing of 11,000 fresh Japanese troops. If they succeeded, Guadalcanal would fall, the Marines would be slaughtered, and America's first offensive would end in a humiliating defeat. Nimitz was faced with an impossible choice. The strict naval dogma warned him never to send battleships into combat without carrier air cover. But the Enterprise was heavily damaged from the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands weeks earlier, operating with a patched-up flight deck. If Nimitz held the battleships back to protect the carrier, Henderson Field would be annihilated and thousands of lives would be wasted. If he sent the battleships in alone, they might be ambushed and sunk in the dark, stripping the Enterprise of her last line of defense. Every theory he had learned at the Naval War College dictated that sending battleships into a night action without support was suicide. But the Marines were out of time. Nimitz made the hardest decision of his career. He ordered Admiral William Halsey to release the 2 battleships. The dogma that battleships were obsolete would just have to be damned. The man chosen to lead this desperate, suicidal mission was Rear Admiral Willis Augustus Lee, Jr. At 54 years old, Lee looked nothing like a war hero. Born in the tiny town of Natal, Kentucky, and a 1908 graduate of the Naval Academy, he was a short, stocky man who was notoriously unkempt. He wore thick glasses and looked far more like a rural high school science teacher than a formidable naval commander. His uniforms never seemed to fit quite right, and when he spoke with his thick Kentucky drawl, other officers often underestimated his sheer brilliance. But beneath that unassuming exterior lay one of the most lethal and sharpest tactical minds in the United States Navy. Lee was a marksman without equal. At the 1920 Olympic Games in Antwerp, he had personally won 5 gold medals, 2 silver medals, and 1 bronze. He could put 10 consecutive shots through a tiny, 1,000-yard aperture. He understood ballistics intuitively, perfectly, the same way a master musician understands rhythm. Trajectories, windage, bullet drop, lead times, these weren't rigid equations to him, they were instincts wired into his very bones. When he looked at a target, his brain automatically knew exactly where to aim. When he transitioned from rifles to heavy naval artillery, that terrifying intuition came with him. But he mastered more than just gunnery. Crucially, he profoundly understood radar, a technology that most admirals in 1940 still viewed with skepticism. While his peers treated radar as a fun novelty, Lee realized that radar was going to completely revolutionize naval warfare forever. A warship equipped with radar could see through the pitch black, through heavy smoke, and through driving rain. It could track enemies far beyond the limits of human sight. Most importantly, with mathematical precision, it could calculate the exact moment and dangle to open fire. It allowed a ship to become a god of death on a battlefield where the enemy was effectively blind. For the past 6 months, Lee had relentlessly drilled his crew aboard the Washington, focusing obsessively on radar-directed gunnery. He completely redesigned the ship's fire control procedures from the ground up to ensure speed and accuracy. In the standard Navy system, a radar operator would report a contact to a talker, then to a gunnery officer, then to turret commanders. Lee took a massive axe to this bureaucratic chain. He cut out the middlemen entirely, wiring the radar operators directly to the gunnery officers. The radar plotting officer could designate targets in real time with zero delay between detection and targeting. The fire control radar would track the splash of the falling shells and instantly calculate corrections between salvos. This system was highly classified and represented a lethal weapon that had never been truly tested in the crucible of surface combat. Lee perfected it through hundreds of hours of mind-numbing drills. Now, he was finally going to test this system in a battle for survival. Lee's Task Force 60 consisted of his flagship, the Washington, the Battleship South Dakota, and 4 destroyers. On paper, it was a formidable force, boasting 2 of the most advanced battleships in the world accompanied by a destroyer's screen. In reality, it was a hastily cobbled-together fleet of ships that had never operated together throughout their entire service history. The South Dakota had just arrived from the States. She was still nursing battle damage from a Japanese bomb at Santa Cruz. Her crew was incredibly green, many of them fresh out of basic training and completely untested in a real naval surface action. The 4 destroyers were pulled randomly from different task groups. They had never sailed with these 2 battleships before tonight. They had zero time to practice coordinated maneuvers, and they had no unified communication or tactical plans for the night. Lee had less than 24 hours to mold this group of total strangers into a cohesive and lethal fighting force. To make matters infinitely worse, the radio systems of the Washington and the South Dakota were completely incompatible with each other. They operated on entirely different frequencies and used different identification protocols throughout the entire night mission. Lee didn't discover this fatal flaw until the fleet was already underway toward the dark waters of Ironbottom Sound. Under immense pressure, he had to patch together a fragile, jury-rigged communication plan using signal lamps and maneuvers. The 2 giant dreadnoughts literally could not talk to each other reliably in the heat of a chaotic surface combat. The escorting destroyers had their own fatal weaknesses. Their 5-inch guns and torpedoes were designed for point-blank brawls. Against Japanese heavy cruisers and battleships, they were massively outgunned and stood little chance in a long-range fight. Their only real advantage was their torpedoes, but to use them, they would have to charge into a suicidal range of 10,000 yards. As the sun slowly sank on November 14th, Lee led his small but highly consequential fleet around the western edge of the island. The 4 destroyers sailed in a column ahead to clear the way, led by the Walk, followed by the Benham, Preston, and Gwyn. The 2 massive battleships trailed close behind. The entire formation stretched for over 2 miles through the darkening waters. The sailors quietly referred to these waters as Ironbottom Sound, knowing the seafloor was carpeted with shattered remains of warships. As they rounded Savo Island, every man on deck could see the horrifying aftermath of the battle that happened 3 days prior. The water was thick with floating oil slicks, jagged debris, and the bodies of fallen American sailors bobbing in the tide. At low tide, the broken masts and superstructures of sunken destroyers even broke the surface of the dark water. Lee knew exactly what was coming for him. Naval intelligence had provided a clear picture of Admiral Willis Lee's approaching armada. The Japanese were bringing the Kirishima for heavy cruisers to light cruisers and a swarm of 9 destroyers. Their goal was absolute destruction. What followed was the prelude to an absolute massacre in the dark waters. In the chaos that echoed the first battle, historians note that Lee's force was soon walking into a deadly trap in the dark. The American destroyers at the front found themselves vastly outnumbered and outgunned as they entered the combat zone. The radar screens on the Washington began tracking the incoming enemy. 16,000 yards, 14,000, 12,000. The tension on the Washington Ness Bridge was suffocating as the operators called out the closing distances in urgent tones. 10,000 yards. At this distance, Japanese lookouts should have easily spotted the towering silhouettes of the American battleships. But the Japanese were focused on Guadalcanal, straining their eyes toward the island for the flashes of their bombardment. They weren't looking behind them. 8,400 yards. For the guns of a battleship, this was point-blank range. Finally, Admiral Lee gave the order to open fire. The main battery erupted in a deafening, earth-shattering roar of synchronization. In that split second, guided by the flawless precision of the fire control radar, the Washington Ness gunners made no mistakes. The first salvo straddled the Kirishima. The second was a direct, catastrophic hit that tore through the ship. For 7 agonizing, glorious minutes, the Washington acted as a cold, mechanical slaughterhouse, unleashing 75 rounds. At least 9, and possibly as many as 20, of those massive shells scored direct hits on the Kirishima. Traveling at 2,300 feet per second, the shells tore through the Kirishima's armor as if it were wet tissue paper. One shell completely obliterated the forward turret, instantly vaporizing every man inside the steel structure. Another penetrated deep into the engineering spaces, detonating violently and destroying the steam turbines and boilers. Yet another ripped a gaping hole below the waterline, causing 3 massive compartments to flood instantly. The Kirishima's steering gear was blown to pieces, jamming her rudder hard to port. The once-proud dreadnought was now steaming uncontrollably in a helpless, dying circle, absorbing relentless punishment. Simultaneously, the Washington Ness secondary battery of 5-inch guns joined the slaughter, raining hundreds of high-explosive shells. Her iconic pagoda mast was struck repeatedly, shattering windows and mowing down personnel with a storm of flying shrapnel. Though severely wounded, the Japanese captain desperately tried to save his ship, but it was completely futile. The Kirishima had been reduced to a floating, burning slaughterhouse, while the Washington was executing this flawless destruction. The South Dakota was fighting for her very life in an absolute nightmare, just seconds after the Washington opened fire. The South Dakota suffered a catastrophic, cascading electrical failure throughout her entire internal systems. Her chief engineer, attempting to fix a minor short in a switchboard, accidentally tied down the main circuit breaker. In a fraction of a second, the entire power grid of the ship failed. The lights went out and radar screens faded to black. The massive gun turrets lost their hydraulic power, and the ammunition hoists ground to a sudden halt. In mere moments, one of America's most powerful warships was reduced to a giant, defenseless, floating target. Although emergency diesel generators kicked in shortly after, they could only provide enough power for core systems. The main guns could be fired via manual control, but without radar, the gunners were completely blind. Japanese seized this golden opportunity instantly. The blinding beams of searchlights locked onto the South Dakota. Every Japanese warship capable of firing turned their guns upon her. 14-inch shells from the Kirishima rained down, along with an endless barrage of 8-inch armor, piercing rounds from the heavy cruisers at Ago and Takao. In a terrifying span of just 90 seconds, the South Dakota absorbed 27 direct hits from enemy fire. Her radio antennas were shredded, radar arrays were blown to pieces, and her secondary batteries were silenced. 38 sailors and 1 Marine were killed instantly, and another 59 were severely wounded tonight, including her captain, Thomas Gatch, who refused to leave the bridge even after taking shrapnel to the neck. The fate of the American destroyers was even more tragic during this chaotic night naval engagement. They had bravely charged the Japanese formation to launch their torpedoes, only to find themselves utterly outmatched. The Preston was the first to fall, caught in a brutal crossfire between Japanese cruisers and destroyers. High explosive shells tore her in hull apart, igniting uncontrollable fires throughout the small warship. The captain gave the order to abandon ship, but before most could escape, the Preston detonated, taking 117 brave men to the icy bottom of Ironbottom Sound tonight. The Walk, leading the column, pushed as close to the Japanese line as she possibly could. She managed to fire a spread of torpedoes, but as she turned to retreat, a counterattack found her. Heavy shells smashed her bridge, killing the captain instantly. Moments later, a long-lanced torpedo slammed her. The Walk literally snapped in half and sank. In minutes, only 75 of her crew survived. The Benham had her entire bow blown off by a torpedo during the chaotic engagement. By some miracle, she remained afloat, but her bulkheads were buckling and she was out of the fight. The Gwyn, the last destroyer standing, was taking multiple hits, burning and struggling to maneuver tonight, forcing her captain to make the agonizing decision to withdraw while pulling survivors from the water. In less than 15 minutes, Lee's destroyer screen had been completely annihilated by the Japanese. The 4 destroyers were either sinking or hopelessly crippled. The South Dakota was deafened blind. Of the 6 American warships that had sailed into the Sound, the Washington now stood completely alone. She was facing 14-1 odds against Japanese warships, including a battleship for cruisers. Any traditional tactician or conventional admiral would have immediately ordered a full retreat tonight. But Willis Lee looked at his radar screen, saw a completely different battlefield than his enemies. In their frantic rush to destroy the South Dakota and the destroyers, the Japanese formation had disintegrated. Some ships were chasing the South Dakota, some were firing on sinking destroyers, and others sailed aimlessly. Most crucially, none of them had spotted the Washington. She had remained perfectly hidden in the radar clutter. They seized this fleeting, golden window of opportunity to strike a crushing blow against the Japanese. But before unleashing his guns, he had to be certain the blip was a Japanese ship and not the South Dakota. He maintained absolute radio silence, refusing even to turn on his searchlights to identify the target ship. Finally, at 23:30, the Kirishima made the fatal error of switching on her own searchlights. That single beam of light signed the Japanese battleship's death warrant, leading to the devastating barrage. After the slaughter of the Kirishima was complete, Lee did not immediately turn south to flee to safety. Instead, he displayed breathtaking tactical brilliance on Rock Urge by steaming northwest at maximum speed. He was intentionally using his precious battleship as bait, drawing the enraged Japanese fleet away from the coast, drawing their fire away from the vulnerable transporters and the retreating, heavily damaged South Dakota. The Japanese radar finally picked up the massive American dreadnought, and their searchlights frantically swept the sea. 15,000 yards, 12,000. At 8,400 yards, Lee delivered his blow. But the danger was far from over. A swarm of furious Japanese destroyers descended upon the Washington like wolves. They were sprinting into range to unleash their devastating long-lanced torpedoes at the lone battleship tonight. Dozens of torpedo trails crisscrossed the dark water as the Japanese desperately tried to sink the American ship. But thanks to Lee's brilliant command and the flawless warning of the radar, the Washington danced through the spread, narrowly dodging the underwater killers by mere yards as she navigated by the ghostly glow of the radar screen. And the dawn of November 15th finally broke over the Pacific. The magnitude of the victory was undeniable. The Japanese transport ships, that had been waiting to unload vital supplies were now sitting ducks off the coast. Stripped of their naval escort, they were systematically bombed into oblivion by American aircraft from Henderson Field. 7 transport ships were sent to the bottom, and the 4,000 Japanese troops who reached shore lacked food. The final, greatest attempt by the Japanese Empire to retake Guadalcanal had been utterly crushed tonight. The tide of the war had irreversibly turned. The Washington became the only battleship to sink another single-handedly. She did so without taking a single scratch from enemy fire, and not one crewman was killed by the enemy. The cost, however, was staggering. The Preston lost 117 men and the Walk lost 175. The Ben Hum eventually sank, and the South Dakota would require months of extensive repairs in dry dock. The United States Navy lost 3 destroyers and over 400 brave men, but they held the line tonight. They saved Guadalcanal. From a broader perspective, this was a monumental triumph of modern technology and tactics. Tragically, however, the upper echelons of the Navy found this victory highly embarrassing for the High Command. It completely contradicted the newly established carrier supreme dogma that had taken hold of the Navy. The Admiralty refused to publicly acknowledge that a battleship still possessed decisive striking power in warfare. They were even more reluctant to admit that radar fire control systems had permanently rewritten the rules. The official after-action reports of this legendary battle were quietly filed away and downplayed by the Navy. The invaluable lessons of radar night fighting were buried in bureaucratic obscurity for many years after. The Washington continued to serve with distinction, earning 13 battle stars throughout her entire history. But she was never again allowed to prove herself in a real surface slugfest against an enemy ship. He was relegated to the shadows, serving as an anti-aircraft escort for the aircraft carriers tonight. Admiral Willis Lee, the tactical genius whose mastery of radar saved Guadalcanal, suffered a fatal heart attack. He passed away on August 25, 1945, at the age of 57 years old. He did not live to see the Japanese sign the instrument of surrender on the deck of the Missouri. Nor did he ever receive the widespread public recognition or the highest honors his brilliance deserved. As for the legendary USS Washington, she was decommissioned in 1947 and sat in the reserve fleet. On June 1, 1960, she was unceremoniously struck from the Naval Vessel Register for good. The following year, on May 24, 1961, she was sold for a paltry $544,000. A legendary vessel that altered the trajectory of a world war was reduced to scrap metal tonight. Amidst the screeching of cutting torches, her magnificent steel hull was broken into small pieces for reuse. No grand monument was ever erected in her honor, no museum ever preserved her magnificent steel hull. But the dark, restless waves of Ironbottom Sound still whisper the story of that night in November. The night when green blips danced across a radar screen, and Willis Lee and his ships stood alone. In the deepest darkness, they delivered the final, most glorious swan song of the battleship era. If you want more hardcore breakdowns of history, its deadliest miscalculations, smash that like button and subscribe. In your strategy, Observer, I'll see you on the next battlefield.